Hi, I'm Tim.
I'm Corinne.
I'm Rosie.
And this time we're journeying to the haunts of suburbia to visit a movie that's traumatized generations of children and changed the way we look at television static. It's Poltergeist.
I don't know what hovers over this house. I've never sensed anything like it.
That thing is in there with my baby!
Now Steven Spielberg crosses a frightening new threshold into a world within our own. Its form is revealed.
What is it?
Its focus is clear. And the games are over.
What's happening?
Poltergeist. It knows what scares you.
The Freeling family lives in a seemingly normal house in a picturesque suburban neighborhood. But something sinister lies beneath the surface of their idyllic dream home. At first, the family reacts with curiosity, even amusement, as strange phenomena begin to occur, but the disturbances become aggressive, leading to the abduction of their youngest daughter, Carol Ann, who vanishes seemingly into thin air. With the help of a team of parapsychologists and a psychic, Diane and Stephen fight to rescue their daughter from the restless spirits who hold her in limbo, unaware of the horrible secret that their American dream is built on. As per usual, we'll be discussing Poltergeist in detail, so if you haven't seen the movie and want to remain unspoiled, we recommend you watch the film before listening to the rest of the episode. Alright, so how did everybody first encounter this movie?
Another childhood movie. I don't know specifically when I saw it, but it pretty terrified me.
My sisters are a lot older than me, so I tended to watch scary movies probably before I should have. So I was probably 5 or 6 when I saw it the first time, her age.
This is one I actually came too late. It's when I hear stories of kids being absolutely traumatized by this movie, and I'm sure I would have been if I had seen it when it was first released, but I caught up with it when I was like 10 or 11, so by then it wasn't quite as strong as it might have been for if I had first seen it back in 1982. Alright, let's get into some basic facts about the movie. The movie was released by MGM on June 4th, 1982, where it opened against Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It also opened 1 week before E.T., which would lead to that summer being dubbed the Summer of Spielberg. The movie would be reissued again later that year in October, just in time for Halloween. It was filmed on a budget of $10.7 million and would go on to earn $121.7 million at the box office, and be nominated for 3 Oscars for visual effects, sound editing, and score, and would end up losing both the score and visual effects awards to E.T. Alright, let's get into the cast and characters. First is Jo Beth Williams as Diane Freeling. Williams is known for her roles in Kramer vs. Kramer, Stir Crazy, The Big Chill, The Day After, and Teachers, and she also appeared on Jabberwocky, the children's show based in Boston, which I remember from Saturday mornings.
I think she's the lead in this movie. I think that Diane Freeling, everything was revolved directly around her as the center of the family. I think as an actress, she did a magnificent job here. I really can't imagine another actress pulling this role off.
Both her and Craig T. Nelson, I guess, were partially cast because they weren't really well known at the time. They were still just sort of coming up as actors, and I think it really adds to it that it isn't a big star. Well, at least back then it wouldn't have been a big star in the lead role. It was somebody that audiences could just kind of accept as this average housewife and mother.
Well, this movie starts out so atmospheric. I think a known actor or known actors would have been a distraction.
I think also it's really hard when playing a parent or in a romantic role to really have that chemistry, and she really seemed like a mom and was desperate to get her kids back and keep them safe. That I don't think, since that was the main dynamic of this movie, I don't think it would have worked if someone seemed a little too into themselves. I mean, she really seemed like a mom.
It's Mommy, sweetheart. Hello, baby. Can you see me? Can you see Mommy? We're home, baby. We're home. Can you find me? Can you find a way home?
And right alongside her is Craig T. Nelson as Stephen Freeling. Before this movie, Nelson had appeared in And Justice for All with Al Pacino, and Stir Crazy, also with Jo Beth Williams again. He'd also appear in All the Right Moves, Action Jackson, and as the lead in the TV show Coach, in addition to voicing Mr. Incredible in The Incredibles. And I like how both of them, they really have this playful quality to their performances. They almost feel like big kids that somehow have, without even realizing it, have stumbled into settling in and being these staid suburban parents.
They absolutely are. They had to have married very, very young. There is mention that she's 31, he's 32. They have a 16-year-old. That means mom got pregnant at 14.
And there's also that great scene where they're sitting around smoking pot.
Your diving days are over.
We're talking Olympics, Diane. Okay?
Let me see your tuck.
Then we can jackknife into the swan. Twist, turn, and splash.
And you almost get the sense these people could have been at Woodstock when they were younger, and that somehow they've bought into the whole American dream thing.
Or at least they're attempting to.
Right, and they, a lot of the kids are fooling around and throwing things at each other, climbing trees, and they're sort of a, laissez-faire approach to parenting, makes them seem a little younger.
I don't quite recall the moment, but there was something that I believe the son was doing, and I was like, oh, that's really dangerous. And she just turns around, she looks and smiles like, oh, you kid.
But also, when Steven says he would never spank his kids, that they're not those type of parents. They're kind of the newer ones who don't believe in physical discipline, or...
They're very loving, just give a little more freedom.
Even the moment where he's having that little battle with the neighbor with the remote control, where he's shooting it like a gun, it's something like a little kid would do, not a grown adult.
Mm-hmm.
Coming to the kids, we have Heather O'Rourke as Carol Ann Freeling. This was actually O'Rourke's first movie. She'd also appear in a recurring role in Happy Days, and of course the sequels to these films. She was cast originally when she was spotted by Spielberg in the MGM commissary, and he gave her an audition, and she actually giggled her way through it to the point where he didn't think she could handle the part. But once he brought in this scary storybook and asked her to scream, he was convinced she could pull it off, and she is adorable in the film and definitely convincingly terrified for a lot of those moments.
She has that ethereal quality that the character needs. Very suburban ideal of a child. She's sweet, she's playful, blonde, blue-eyed, tiny. Her side of the room is just pink and frilly. She represents the innocence that this movie corrupts, or rather is corrupted by the house.
She's also so young that she oftentimes doesn't really know to be scared at things that are creepy, like the voices coming from the TV. To her, it's just, oh, this is neat, somebody to play with, somebody to talk to.
What do you look like? Talk loud, I can't hear you. Hey, hello, hello, I can't hear you. Five. Yes. Yes. I don't know. I don't know.
I think that's why they chose her to be so young, because there's a, before you really get to that age of reason, one takes the world very literally, and unless you have a history of being scared by something, you hear voices. It's a little odd that they're coming from the TV, but they're just voices.
Voices come from the TV anyway.
Right, exactly. And until someone was actually causing injury and blowing big gusts of wind, she wasn't actually scared. And I don't think that would have worked in an older child.
Yeah, we can see
Robbie was terrified.
Yeah, we can see in Robbie, he's afraid of the trees, afraid of the clown. He knows to be scared of things.
Right.
The only scene that O'Rourke was scared by while they were filming was the scene where she's being pulled into the closet and all the toys are being pulled into it. When she was suspended over this angled set and wind machines were going, and she became so terrified, Spielberg stopped filming, told her she didn't have to film that anymore, and they did the rest with a double and then a dummy for later on in the film when they do that again with the tentacle. Of course, as is well known, unfortunately, while filming Poltergeist 3, O'Rourke died at the age of 12 from cardiac arrest due to complications from intestinal stenosis, and that movie was actually finished with a stand-in when they reshot the ending and dedicated to her memory. And I can't help but feel, knowing that, it casts a weird pall over the film watching it now.
It does, because there's a big theme of the afterlife and what happens after you die. Things die now. Again, because she's so young, I think her first real experience with death was the canary, and it can spark those, well, what happens later? And I think, and we'll get into this more, but one of the greatest themes is that the poltergeists seem to play off of the fears, the various, very specific fears of each family member. So because of her preoccupation with death, I believe that Poltergeists kind of drew her in. The right age and the right fear.
Mm-hmm. And it was mentioned they can see what you're afraid of. And,
Yeah.
you know, her after her first experience with death, after the burial of the canary, she said very lightheartedly, "Now can I have a goldfish?" And so she probably wasn't taking death seriously before, or didn't really understand the permanence of it. And so maybe that's why they chose to keep her there among the dead but undead for so long.
There's also a hint in the movie that she's sort of tied to the house because, as Stephen's boss says, she was actually born in the house. So it makes me wonder if she had to be the one that they pulled for that reason. Also, among the Freeling children is Dominic Dunn, playing Dana Freeling. Dunn appeared in various television programs such as Breaking Away and Lou Grant, and she was originally going to star in the V miniseries, the original one, for she was unfortunately murdered by her boyfriend in October of 1982 after this film was completed. This is actually her only feature film credit.
She's my favorite character because she's barely in the movie, but I think she has a much bigger role for the family itself. I think she's the first crack in their white picket fence dreams. I think the daughter's pregnant. That's another theory of mine, but I think she's pregnant. We only see her in her first shot. She's eating a lot, and she's eating very strange combinations: a pickle, potato salad, a stalk of celery, a full stalk of celery. We know that she goes off to her friends' houses a lot. And later on, she mentions that she knows that hotel they're talking about.
So you better get Brian to bring you home right after dinner, because Dad wants us to stay at the Holiday Inn on I-74.
Oh, yeah, I remember that place.
You what?
So the daughter has obviously been, she's already sexually active. In the last scene we see with her, when she gets into the car accident just before the house implodes, she is covered in hickeys.
Which, again, she kind of takes after her mother in terms of getting pregnant at that age.
There's that big fear of your child following in your footsteps, the mistakes that you've made as you were growing up.
I think also she was presented at first as the unimpressed teenager and is too cool for everyone. And when she finally gets scared, I think that's supposed to be the last incredulous person. Similar to the neighbors, it's not till the very end that anyone else has any idea of what's going on besides those people in the field of the paranormal.
Next we have Oliver Robbins as Robbie Freeling. Robbins would also appear in the creepy TV movie Don't Go to Sleep. I don't know if you remember that one. That was another one that traumatized many people as a kid. And Airplane 2. And of course the sequel to this, and he'd later turn to writing and directing.
I think we see the most diverse fears in Robbie, and so many of them are very childhood-based fears. Under the bed, the clown, the closet, the dark. He's afraid of the tree outside his window. Very, very strong childhood fears.
And it's interesting that he's a little bit more involved in what's going on once the parapsychologists show up. That he has that long conversation with Dr. Lesh, and that he's the one watching the monitors with them and asking who these people are and where they're coming from. As opposed to Dana, who's just kind of in the background with her hands over her ears.
And as far as an actor, Oliver Robbins was so compelling. Even now, watching it as an adult, that first scene when he's screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy," because he can hear Carol Ann in the TV.
Come over here! Come over here!
It's striking, and it's still kind of scary.
Yeah, he's barely coherent. He can't even really form complete sentences, and it really feels like how a child would be reacting after nearly being eaten by a tree and then discovering that your sister has been sucked into God knows where. Next we have Beatrice Straight playing Dr. Lesh. Straight was one of the original members of the Actors Studio, and she previously appeared in Network, where she set a record for the shortest performance that's won an Oscar. She'd also appear in Endless Love, Two of a Kind, and Power. And I like that she's not what you normally see with this kind of character in a movie, where they're usually eccentric and a bit of a crackpot. That no, she's this very dignified, distinguished scientist who kind of knows how ridiculous her field is, at least at that point, where it's not taken seriously, that she knows she's not going to get a lot of professional respect doing it, but she still wants to prove all this stuff and document it and put science into it.
Parapsychology isn't something you master in. There are no certificates of graduation, no licenses to practice. I am a professional psychologist who spent most of my time engaged in this ghostly hobby, which makes me, I suppose, the most irresponsible woman of my age that I know.
I don't think she even takes her profession seriously. You saw how she was shaking, because I think that was her first true interaction with the paranormal.
One of her associates describes that they filmed this little matchbox car moving across this floor for 7 hours. That's usually the kind of thing that parapsychologists find. Cold spots, weird, bizarre shapes on photographs, that's it. Not stuff flying around the room at you. So
I thought a great move by both director and screenwriter was at the beginning of the scene that we see her. We don't know, are they at a police station filing a report? We don't know if it's an academic environment, if they're detectives, if it's real estate. I mean, they're professional enough that we're not quite sure who we're dealing with yet.
Another really wonderful choice is that the parents don't immediately go to the police. They don't go to real authority. They're enough of a child or children inside that they go right for a paranormal investigator. We don't want to tell the police because they think they'll be taken as insane.
Well, there's also that implication they don't really want the press involved and people to know because they realize what that's going to do to their lives from that point on. And even the suggestion that maybe Stephen is still slightly conscious of his position with his company and that he doesn't want to be suddenly seen as this crackpot.
And also, they really want to get her back. By the time they come in, they're almost communicating with it regularly and know its limits and how to talk, so they probably feel like that's the most likely person to help.
And she brings in Zelda Rubinstein playing Tangina Barons. Poltergeist was Rubinstein's breakthrough role, and she'd reprise it for both the sequels. She'd also appear in 16 Candles, Southland Tales, Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, and had a great career doing voiceovers and narration, notably for that paranormal reality show, Scariest Places on Earth. She did have a great voice for that, and she uses it a lot here. She actually claimed to have some psychic experiences while they were filming, where at one point she claims that she was aware that her dog had passed on before she actually found out. I like how there's kind of a progression of authority, that you have Dr. Les show up and present this kind of scientific basis of it, and when she's stumped, she turns to somebody higher, and then once Tangina shows up and starts telling us what's going on, you automatically just want to believe her. You want to believe that this person knows what she's dealing with and knows how to deal with these creepy phenomenon, and inspires confidence in both the Freelings and the audience as a result.
Honey, you're gonna be strong for me and for your daughter. I could do absolutely nothing without your faith in this world and your love for the children.
I will. Believe me, I will.
And will you do anything I ask, even if it comes contrary to your beliefs as a human being and a Christian?
Yes, I promise, please.
The last big one is James Karen as Mr. Teague, Stephen's boss. I always forget what a small part he has in this movie. He only really appears in 2 scenes, and it's not until an hour in that we see him. Karen's a notable character actor. He popped up on soaps like As the World Turns and All My Children, as well as 8 is Enough. He's also appeared in The China Syndrome, All the President's Men. I know him best from Return of the Living Dead, where he played Frank, one of the 2 guys who slowly turns into a zombie over the course of that movie, and he's hilarious there. And he'd also reunite with director Tobe Hooper on Invaders from Mars, where he played the general who's hunting the Martians. He says supposedly he got hate mail for years due to his part in this movie, and you can see why. He reminds me a lot of the mayor from Jaws, that guy who puts the bottom line ahead of safety or even propriety in terms of moving this cemetery out of the way to build real estate over top of it.
We've already made arrangements for relocating the cemetery.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, come on. I mean, that's sacrilegious, isn't it?
Oh, don't worry about it. After all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people. Besides, we've done it before.
When?
In 76. Right down there.
He also, in this film, represents the old guard and real adults who don't believe in the paranormal, who have very steady jobs and steady lives, the people that you put up your best face to. And as we've talked about, the parents really haven't quite gotten there. They still appear to be pretending to be this perfect family.
The last 2 notable ones to mention are Richard Lawson, who plays Ryan, one of Dr. Lesch's associates. He also appeared in Dirty Harry, Audrey Rose, and Streets of Fire. And the other one is Martin Casella, who plays the less fortunate parapsychologist who gets bitten and is probably turned into a vegetarian based on what happens in this movie. He doesn't have a lot of screen credits. He only appeared in bit parts in movies like RoboCop 2. Before this, he was actually Spielberg's production assistant, while they were filming Raiders of the Lost Ark, which makes me wonder if Spielberg saw him and went, hey, this guy's got something. I'm going to put him in this role. And while he doesn't get a lot to do, he's also convincingly terrified and gets a couple of the movie's most memorable moments. Coming to the crew, this is where it gets a little thorny. The director is Tobe Hooper, or is it? Because there's actually a big question about who actually directed this movie. Hooper, of course, had directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and that's the movie that got Spielberg's attention, made Spielberg give him the assignment for this. He also directed Eaten Alive and The Funhouse. But watching the movie, and even in the press at the time, there was a lot of debate as to whether it was actually Spielberg directing the movie or Hooper himself. Because in the column kind of on Spielberg's side, supposedly Spielberg wanted to direct this, but because he was in pre-production from E.T., contractually wasn't allowed to direct another movie. So there's a suggestion he set up Hooper as the ostensive director while he was actually doing it behind the scenes. He made statements suggesting Hooper wasn't really a take-charge person on the set, and it was much more of a collaboration. And then, looking at the movie, a lot of the visuals do look like Spielberg's other films. People staring at things in wonder, the bright flashing lights, the camera movements. Hooper, once he offered his first cut, that was it. He didn't really supervise the special effects, or the music, or the rest of the editing. And even some of the people on set, Frank Marshall claims Spielberg was really the one calling the shots, and Zelda Rubinstein claims that Hooper was supposedly kind of affected by drug use at the time and wasn't really totally there, and that Spielberg was the one who was actually giving directions to the actors. But on the other side, Oliver Robin said it was Hooper who was actually working with the kids and set up the environment for them where they could just kind of be kids. And the cinematography, after seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacre again recently, does look like a lot of the kind of gliding camera shots that film has.
I lean toward it being a collaboration. I don't believe that Spielberg would outright violate his contract.
Yeah, the Directors Guild wasn't sure. They actually launched an inquiry, and Spielberg published a letter claiming that no, it was just a collaboration. He just offered tips here and there, being the screenwriter and the producer, and that was it.
Yeah, I mean, if they have confirmation, I don't think there should really be controversy over this. It's a collaboration.
Well, in Hollywood, it's tough to tell if it's actual confirmation or just trying to be polite about it. Hooper claimed that the whole thing started because the LA Times visited the set and saw Spielberg just directing second unit stuff and just assumed that he was directing the whole movie, but it's still not totally clear, and as a result, Hooper actually didn't get work for a while for this. It was 3 years before he got a contract to do movies at Canon Films like Life Force and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, but the mystery still hovers to this day, because people on both sides claim one thing or the other. The script was written by Spielberg, Michael Grace, and Mark Victor. Grace and Victor also wrote the sequel and co-wrote Cool World, Marked for Death, and produced the Stephen King movie Sleepwalkers.
That's not a great resume
Not
at
really,
all.
no. I guess originally they wanted Stephen King to write the script, but couldn't really agree on a deal, which I don't know if it would have worked as a Stephen King. I think he would have made it a little too cynical, especially on the part of the lead characters. Apparently Spielberg had wanted Grace and Victor to write a remake of A Guy Named Joe, the old Spencer Tracy movie, and they were much more interested in doing this story instead. You can see Guy Named Joe pops up in the movie, and of course Spielberg would remake that years later, as always. The other thing is that this movie looks a lot like a Twilight Zone episode called Little Girl Lost, where a girl rolls off her bed and rolls into this hole into another dimension, and the parents hear her disembodied voice and are trying to find her. Written by Richard Matheson, who would later write the Twilight Zone movie for Spielberg and several other directors, and he claims, while, yeah, maybe they were inspired, that everyone is urging him to take legal action, he didn't really bother. He thought, yeah, maybe they were inspired by it, but who cares?
That happens a lot with Twilight Zone episodes. Everybody was so influenced by them that some accidental details could have been lifted, or some outright interpretations.
Yeah, if you see something as a kid, it gets stuck in your brain. You might not really remember where you got the idea for something, but... the cinematography was by Matthew F. Leonetti. He also filmed movies such as Ice Pirates, which seems to come up a lot for us in these episodes.
Ice Pirates, we need to do Ice Pirates
we
sometime.
Will have to eventually.
It's Barbarella-level craziness.
He also shot Commando, Strange Days, a couple of the Star Trek movies like Star Trek First Contact, and Mortal Kombat Annihilation. There's a classic for you. As we mentioned, it does bear a resemblance to a lot of other Spielberg films in the way that the use of the anamorphic frame, which is beautiful here with the lens flares every time they go by, a really strong light source.
Oh, it's very atmospheric, which also reminds me of the Close Counters and E.T. to some degree. They're both reality-based horrors.
Also have a lot of scenes punctuated by like bright shafts of light and people silhouetted in front of them, the use of smoke.
Yeah.
And it's much scarier to not see the monster, as to see it as little as possible in any kind of horror movie, because then your mind is creating what they're looking at or what could be behind that light rimmed doorway, and you know.
Or just the implications we get of the afterlife, that we never actually go in there, we just see it through that closet door as these bright lights and weird rippling effects. And the use of the strobe light whenever they were watching the TV.
Yeah,
the static.
The strobe light gets used a lot and to good effect. And like you said, the TV, but also the closet.
Yeah. Or in the living room as that hole in the ceiling is starting to
Yeah.
open up and things dropping out.
I mean, the very opening shot is, the dog running up the stairs to that strobe light, and it already looks, choppy and creepy, and it's not even a human character.
The editor for the movie was Michael Kahn, Spielberg's longtime editor, who worked with him on Close Encounters and movies such as the Indiana Jones movies, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, all the way up to Lincoln. He also edited Fatal Attraction and Twister. And he's great at building tension through cutting. There's that great scene where Robbie is counting off, trying to see if the storm is coming or going. And the way they have that long shot of him counting and cutting to the tree outside, each time the tree looks a little creepier until finally it's actually moving and reaching through the window.
1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1.
The editing is really wonderful in this film. However, there is one spot when I feel like we're cut off in the middle of a sentence and we jump to a completely different scene, and that's very awkward.
And all of a sudden it's like there's no air except that you can breathe. And you're getting pulled along and then...
Hi, Ben.
Oh, Mr. Taylor. Hi.
Which, I guess it was a last-minute edit. It's the scene where they're in the kitchen and the weird phenomenon is pulling things along the floor. And you'll notice that Jo Beth Williams says something about, we'll get Pizza Hut later. I guess the scene would have ended with Craig T. Nelson saying something to the graph, I hate Pizza Hut. And Pizza Hut objected. So at the last minute, they very crudely just chopped the last few seconds off of the scene and cut right into the next one.
It's jarring and not in a great way. It pulls you out of the film.
And especially because that moment is the first time anyone besides her is seeing this phenomenon.
Right.
That's an important thing to digest.
And you can see when it cuts to the next scene, there's a bit of a flash cut, so it looks like it was something done very roughly at the last minute. But yeah, that's really, really jarring. I used to wonder about that. Is it supposed to imply that he's not listening to her or something when she's talking about what it feels like because he looks traumatized while he's just leaning against the wall? But no, it was just an unfortunate commercial reason for it. And finally, the music is by Jerry Goldsmith again, and this guy is just incredibly versatile.
The music in this movie is used to such wonderful effect. We have virtually no music in this film, and when it's used primarily when something paranormal is happening.
I like how much of the first half of the film there's very little music at all, as you mentioned. Even during the creepy parts, it's not until, there's actual interaction with the closet, with the television, that really the big film score style movie starts, and that's always really, really creepy. And that's part of what people love about older films, especially horror and suspense, is that there's no music. And you are clued in that you should be feeling a certain way by how soundtracks are, and if you have no clues for that, it's very disconcerting.
We do get music. The first scene, when the credits are rolling for the first time, we get the national anthem.
And we do get the main titles are under this really beautiful, idyllic theme to set the tone of the neighborhood. This idea that, it's this wonderful, beautiful, sweet place. And slowly that's kind of pulled away from us as the film gets bigger and we get into the larger, more kind of thunderous music as things start happening.
It's also very, as they strip away the veneer of this perfect family, perfect job, perfect life, the music gets very ominous, but it gets more frequent as well. Toward the end of the movie, we have pure just scene after scene with music that is very creepy but doesn't overwhelm the film. You know that my standard for really good music in a film is how much do I notice it.
Yeah, it should be subliminal and just guide you to feel something without throwing your face in it. I also like the use of the children's choir, which not only resonates the whole idea of these young children caught in this situation, but it almost suggests the lost souls that are caught on the other side that get released at the end of the movie.
I believe that the psychic woman, she says about, all children can cross over. So it really felt like their house, in a way, had been built over the child cemetery, well, the child burial grounds.
Moving on to some of the things about the production, the movie originally received an R rating, but Spielberg appealed and used a lot of his clout to get it dropped down to a PG rating, which, to be fair, other than the scene with the guy tearing his face off in the sink, this is about a PG for that era, I think.
Did he use his clout, or were there any cuts?
There weren't really any cuts, no. Otherwise, I think that scene over the sink would have been the first thing to go.
Yeah, I've seen worse with a PG rating from the early 80s.
The house from the film is located in Simi Valley, California, and actually still exists to this day. If you look at any of the websites, they're like, please, there are people living here, don't bother them. So I guess they've had some trouble from fans who wanted to go see the house. Let's talk a little bit about the special effects in the movie, and one question occurs to me. Do having these really amazing, fancy special effects detract from the scare factor for you guys, or actually make it scarier?
It's always hard to separate your mind from, we have better special effects now, so if I was the same age I am now when it first came out, and it would have been much more effective, I don't think they were cheesy enough to pull away from it, but whenever I see the monster, it makes it slightly less scary for anything. I think that the best ones were the collection of souls with the wispy light balls around them, especially because you don't really, when you're first watching it, it sort of looks like one person, and it's not until they're watching it again on their monitors that you see it's a group of people. That, I think, was the most, really struck me the deepest. I mean, the yelling skeleton head, from the side is a little better than it is from the front, but and the wisps were okay.
The fact, I think, that we're seeing it on TV screen helps, too. It's almost like there's this layer of separation from it.
I did have a little trouble with the skeletons at the end and the coffins, and I know that was supposed to be the big reveal moment of having just moved the cemetery stones.
Son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones! Why? Why?
I just feel like it could have been done differently. It felt like it was a natural conclusion based on what was happening in the house and the knowledge that they had moved the cemetery. So when it got to that point, it felt the special effects, the skeletons, everything going on just didn't work as well for me. I think it starts basically when the father pulls Carol Ann out too early and we see this giant monster. It's great to know that there are consequences for not listening, but it didn't work for me. It was a little too much.
It didn't help for me when we see that monster again later and it has the MGM lion roar. Which you'd see at the beginning of the movie, too. It's kind of hard to separate that. For me, it reminds me a little of the remake of The Haunting. We had all these great CGI special effects, but watching it, I was never scared of in that movie because I'm like, oh, look, that's a really pretty effect. And that's where I wonder if, when there's an amazing special effect, if you start looking at it as a special effect rather than something really creepy happening in the scene.
As always, the practical effects were much more effective for me. Falling from the ceiling covered in glop. The whole room spinning for the mother. There's a scene where the mother is supposed to be thrown around the room, basically, and the entire room is spun to do that special effect, and that's much more effective for me than the smoke, basically. At one point, there's animated smoke, and animation as a special effect does not really hold up, and it never will. So, yeah, practical effects again.
For me, one of the most effective is the moment where she's adjusting the chairs in the kitchen and turns around and comes back and they're stacked up on the table, which is just sleight of hand. Literally, as soon as the camera pans over, crew members come, move the chairs, and put this pre-assembled one there, and you can actually see them reflected in the toaster as he's moving back and forth. But those kind of ones where you're not even really expecting it, and all of a sudden, boom, something like that happens, I think those work the best. And I think most of the haunted house movies that have little things like that, they're a bit more effective.
It's setting up the atmosphere, which is much more terrifying than a jump scare. I mean, jump scares are great, but we're so used to them now, they don't have quite the same effect they should. But a good atmospheric movie stays with you and kind of terrorizes you for a long time.
All right, let's talk about some of the themes and meanings of the movie. One big one for me is this idea of the American dream gone wrong, that as we said, Stephen and Diane have gotten pulled into this kind of materialistic view of what success is supposed to be. They have the pretty house, they have all the modern conveniences, the TV with remote controls, the pool being put in, and all of it is built on something horrific that they don't even realize.
They nearly have a TV in every room. It isn't just one TV. In the 80s, having more than one TV was a big deal.
When it comes to it, in the end, they pull an Amityville and leave it all behind.
Yes.
And it's just them, just these 5 people in this hotel room, and yet they kind of have everything in that. They don't need all this stuff. They're all safe. They're all together. That's what's really important by the end of the film.
They basically have the 2.5 kids. They have the son and the daughter that they had probably under better circumstances than their first daughter that they had when they were teenagers. They have a dog. They have a house. He has a great stable job. And again, as you go through the movie, all of that is just stripped away. All of that external societal success is stripped away.
Another theme that comes up is adulthood and childhood and the different fears of both. We see that Steve and Diane are caught up in the normal adult concerns, the job, the home, taking care of the kids, and these 2 kids are dealing with basically childhood ideas. Robbie is afraid of the tree outside and the clown, and Carol Ann is talking to the TV people, which we even see Stephen regard as one of her little games where she has the phone.
Daddy, it's for you.
You tell him to take a message, sweet pea.
I don't want to take a message.
You gotta wonder now if maybe there was a voice on the other end of that phone that would have had something to say.
Or if there is, yes, a message from the other side. There's a lot to do with not just fears, messages, disconnected telephones, talking to people who you can't see or can't quite connect with on one level or another. So communication, very huge theme in this movie.
Yeah, and I like that idea that all of Steve and Diane's concerns kind of fall by the wayside, and these childhood ideas are the ones that actually prove to be the most important in the movie.
Yeah.
The things that would normally be disregarded by adults.
I took notes as we were watching, and I wrote down fears as we came across them. The mother has, of course, the typical fear of losing her children, especially surrounding the swimming pool and the TV. The swimming pool being an external, physical fear, something that could kill her child.
Oh, shit, Stephen. What if we, dig the pool, and Carol Ann sleepwalks and she falls into it before there's any water?
Oh, honey, no.
The mom's fear of the swimming pool, none of her children are harmed by the swimming pool, but she nearly dies in the swimming pool. And the TV being something that could influence them. I mean, you could take it as far as just the spirits, but if you go a little deeper, what you see on the TV affects you. In the early 80s, we have MTV and things that aren't quite how people think normal should be. Crazy hair, punk rock. So there's also the idea of the corruption of children and their innocence. That's another fear the mother has, her daughter growing up too fast. Then the son has, of course, very childhood fears. The fear of the tree, the clown, bullies. He's afraid of the weather, of things under the bed, and all of these fears are realized. It's not just that we see he's afraid, he has to live through every single one of his fears.
And then, of course, by the end, he doesn't cover the clown.
Yes.
He's conquered that one at least.
The father, he fears the loss of his stable job, and he fears that people will see what's going on in his house and deem it abnormal, as strange.
And you can even see that when his boss visits, and it seems like the ghosts are trying to get his attention, shifting things around, making the light bulbs glow.
Yeah, realizing the father's fear. We have no idea what the older daughter fears because we don't see her. And she almost fears nothing until the very end. I mean, she runs away, which is a very teenage reaction to familial stress. So I can't say that she had an outright fear. And you could even see that the poltergeists were playing on fears of basically everybody. The ghost hunter, whose name I can't remember, the one who leaves.
Oh, Marty.
Yeah, Marty. I mean, he's got a thing with food. I mean, he goes in, he's eating food, so to see that all of a sudden the food is maggoty and disgusting, and then he goes in the bathroom and he's falling apart, he's decaying, so you can almost extrapolate that he has a fear of his beauty disappearing in a way, his of changing and getting older.
I almost thought it was just like meat. He sees the meat coming to life and then he tears the meat off his face, basically.
Yes.
Another theme is belief in science and then the conception of the supernatural in a scientific way. I like that all these phenomenon are, in a way, sort of measurable by science. The thing with the tennis balls, where they do that experiment of throwing it through one portal and having it come out another, and it behaves in a, not a logical way, but a predictable way, which is something very big in science when you're measuring things. Or the idea that each level of understanding about the afterlife kind of gets superseded by the next one. You start with the funeral for the bird and this little girl who thinks that he's going to need a blanket and a photo and food and stuff like that. And then that gets kind of pulled aside for Dr. Lesch's explanation.
Some people believe that when people die, there's a wonderful light, as bright as the sun, but it doesn't hurt to look into it. All the answers to all the questions that you ever want to know are inside that light. And when you walk to it, you become a part of it forever.
Voiced in a way that makes it understandable for Robbie, and then you get to Tangina, who takes that religious component of it completely out of the way and says it's more just transition through a barrier of consciousness.
These souls, who for whatever reason are not at rest, are also not aware that they have passed on. They're not part of consciousness as we know it. They linger in a perpetual dream state, a nightmare from which they cannot awake. Inside the spectral light is salvation, a window to the next plane. They must pass through this membrane where friends are waiting to guide them to new destinies.
I like how each one replaces the other and broadens the whole scope of what the afterlife means for these people.
There is definitely a theme of belief, faith, Christianity, supernatural, trust, core connections between people, these things that you need to believe in each other, and the idea of believing in a God or a life after death.
One aspect that wasn't as clear to me that maybe you both can offer insight on was that there seemed to be two discrete hauntings, if you will, and one seemed focused on unknown souls of possibly could have been from the graveyard or otherwise, where all of them but the main bad one are able to find closure. Obviously the main guy, since it returns and then does the whole thing with the coffins, remained. And then separately, it almost seemed like the bodies from the coffins, there weren't souls related to them, but that main negative being was doing that to kind of explain that wasn't, that he or it almost seemed like the police of the afterlife. You shouldn't have done this. All the souls did get closure, but you still shouldn't have done this. And those were two very different instances.
I'm not entirely convinced that the negative soul couldn't move on. I believe that the father, when he pulls Carol Ann and his wife out too soon, allows that malevolent force to also cross more into the plane of reality, so that this malevolent force can have more influence over things in that world rather than the spiritual world.
It's hard to say. It almost just seems like it's this really bitter entity that sees this opportunity where, because of the whole thing with the cemetery, these ghosts couldn't cross over, and thinks, I can wreak havoc on them.
Yeah.
I can prevent them from going where they're supposed to go by snatching this kid out.
There's one more thing. A terrible presence is in there with her. So much rage, so much betrayal. I've never sensed anything like it.
And yeah, I agree that by the end, those bodies, they aren't really ghosts, they're just puppets for this thing to basically throw at the Freelings as they're trying to escape.
Absolutely.
Of course, the sequels would retcon this into the Reverend Cain character, which, while he's very creepy in that one, mostly due to the actor, I didn't really care for the idea of that character. I much prefer that it is this unknown creature or entity. Maybe it was human once, maybe it's a demon, maybe it's something we never really understand, but I think that's much creepier than what they came up with in the sequels.
There is another thing that I wonder, because the Poltergeist seems to be focused on fears. Did the father start to fear that the cemetery hadn't actually been moved? And are the skeletons the physical manifestation of that fear?
rather than being actual.
Yeah.
Because they were all at the same level of decomposition, which wouldn't have happened in a regular, people die at different times.
And they established that with the objects that fall through the portal, that some are very old, some are much more recent.
Right. Now, why did the medium not sense that the malevolent presence was still there?
That's one of the things I wondered. How did both of the mediums miss that they were on some kind of burial ground?
Well, maybe because that's more of a physical thing, and then she was already so inundated with the spirits, it didn't occur to her that that's the reason why. It's
or
hard
more
to say.
that one big one still remained. That should have.
That is the big question. Why she didn't sense that it was still around, unless it disappeared somewhere, hid for a while, and then came out when she was no longer there.
Right.
I had one question. How is it if they're digging up pools for this suburban development? How is it nobody has found these coffins before?
Watching it again, I had forgotten about the pool digging, and I just assumed they were going to find coffins. It might be an error, or I'm just going to go with it was a little outside the cemetery zone.
Or the location of a pool, there might happen to have not been any. But in the whole neighborhood, yeah.
I just imagine kids swimming and right outside the walls of the pool are corpses just like, ah! The other thing I have to note is how strong the female characters are in this movie compared to the male characters. I mean, Stephen, he helps out Robbie. He, is there to pull on the rope during the big thing, but as you said, he kind of screws it up by going too early. And his only other big plot thing is discovering the truth about the cemetery. It's Diane and Dr. Lesh and Tangina who really pull the weight in terms of getting Carol Ann back.
The idea of getting Carol Ann back and that the whole sequence, it's a woman's world. It is all about rebirth and the womb and the rope being the umbilical cord, and the mother, of course, has to go in and get her because it's a woman's world and she is rebirthing her child. They both come out covered in what could be considered placental material, and they have to be breathed back to life like they weren't breathing in the womb. There was trouble. So the father, and even to some extent the male paranormal investigator, they're fooling around in women's work, which is of course why he screws it up. And it had to specifically be a man that screwed that part up.
It even goes to Tangina's line that she will only hear her mother's voice, that it has to be
Mm-hmm.
Diane who tells her, even though actually it is Stephen who tells her to stay away from the light or go to the light after that.
And for the children, the male child is the most afraid and is the least helpful.
Right. Because it's terrifying, this idea of what life begins as and how life becomes. I mean, that's got to be very, very terrifying to some children. Tangina, she acts as a midwife. Her only role really is to coach the mother through this.
I do like that moment, though, where Diane says,
What do you think you're doing? I'm going in after her! Won't come to you! Let me go! You've never done this before! Neither have you! You're right, you go!
It was pretty wonderful. In a way, it felt like that going forward with my theory, if the baby was in distress in the womb, somebody would have to physically go in there and get her out. And that's what the mother does in the end.
let's get into some of the little bits of trivia. Now, this one isn't really confirmed. Allegedly, some of the skeletons used in the film were real because it was cheaper to buy real ones than fake ones. I'm not sure if that was the case with this one. I know that did happen with Poltergeist 2, which caused a lot of the crew members to get really freaked out when they were filming that one. But
it's kind of gross and disrespectful.
Happily, that's not the case anymore. They always make sure to use fake ones now. When Marty goes into the bathroom and has that hallucination where he's peeling the skin off his face, the hands actually belong to Steven Spielberg, because they had this puppet to do it, and it was kind of a one-take thing. Once they tore it up, that was it, and the actor was a little nervous about doing it, thought he'd screw it up, so Spielberg stepped right up and
that
tore it
scene
off.
did look a little strange. I just thought it was because they did have to pull it off of a mummy, and the face had to have been a double, but it had a little strangeness to it.
It's not the most perfect makeup effect. The guy who did the makeup effects, Craig Reardon, is really good, but that one isn't one of his most successful. Joe Beth Williams is worried about filming the pool scene because while they were filming, they had all this lighting equipment set up around the set, and she was worried something was going to drop in an electrocutor. So Spielberg jumped into the pool with her and said, "I'll do it if you will," and that actually got her doing it. Thankfully, they both emerged just fine. A little scarier was when Robbie was being attacked by the clown towards the end, and they did it in reverse. They wrapped the arm around his head and pulled it off so it looked like it was wrapping around his neck. Apparently one time the mechanism actually tightened so much that he was choking, and Spielberg and Hooper just thought, wow, he's really doing well with this. Here, look towards the camera, and realized he was turning blue, and Spielberg got up and tore the arm off and tore the mechanism off before he could really be hurt. But if people were afraid of that clown, they'd be even more so, I think, hearing that anecdote.
Yes.
There were a couple scenes cut from the movie. One where Lesh is actually advised by one of her colleagues to bring in Tangina to help. One big one is when Diane's being flung around the room. Do you notice when that weird bit of spectral energy hits the wall over the bed? Later on, there's a little stain there where the dog is barking at it. Originally, that stain would have come back and turned into this weird pulsing mass of flesh that was grabbing at her, kind of similar to the one that opens up in the kids' room to pull them in. And there are stills of it. I don't know why it was cut. It's really kind of gross looking. Maybe that's why. But instead, they just went with the rotating room and kept it a little bit simpler. And also, when Marty is bitten by the creature, I guess originally we were going to see that, where he goes up to the door, gets hoisted up in the air and grabbed and flung around, and it bites him. But that's another one I'm glad we didn't see. I think it's creepier to have him just coming down the stairs looking shell-shocked. Another little cute joke is that the name on the motel marquee at the end of the movie, Dr. Fantasy, is the nickname of Frank Marshall, the producer. And this is an interesting one to me. The only death we see in the movie is the bird. Mm-hmm. Nobody else actually dies, which is kind of rare for a horror movie, especially one like this. Let's talk about the legacy of the movie. Of course, as we mentioned, it inspired 2 sequels, and the TV show Poltergeist: The Legacy that had nothing to do with the movie series, and the remake that just came out this summer. The really unfortunate and creepy part is the supposed Poltergeist curse, where several members of the cast met unfortunate ends. We mentioned Heather O'Rourke and Dominic Dunn. There was also Lou Perryman, who played Pugsley, one of the construction guys early in the film, who was murdered in 2009, killed with an axe. Julian Beck, who played Reverend Kane in Poltergeist 2, who died before they were finished filming that one because of stomach cancer. And from the same movie, Will Sampson. He died of kidney failure about a year after they were finished that. So, do you think there's actually a curse, or is it just a series of unfortunate coincidences?
I'm going to go for coincidences. I have a very hard time believing that a film would be cursed.
I think it's more sad than anything else, and it does color how you watch it.
It seems like this comes up with a lot of these series. I remember The Omen, they said there was a curse where a bunch of people died, and The Exorcist too, but...
It's also the subject matter of these movies. Like, you're messing around with things of the afterlife and the devil and God, and you shouldn't do that. So, of course... when people do die or have mishaps, it can very easily be attributed to the subject matter. And I'm sure there are other films that have just as many unfortunate incidents, but we don't hear about because the subject matter is much different.
So what's everybody's favorite scene from the movie?
I think it'd be pretty hard to beat the chairs in the kitchen scene, because for a few reasons. One is it's so fast, there's no music, you are startled just as much as the character.
TV people.
Uh-huh.
Do you see them?
Uh-uh. Do you?
And also, she's obviously then spending the rest of the day observing and studying it. And in a horror movie, the most uncomfortable part of a horror movie is when no one else believes the character, what's going on, because that's when the audience really, you're alone. It's like when you're having a nightmare and you try to scream and no sound comes out. So there's something very satisfying about him then witnessing it, and you're like, all right, the family's in this together. And it was so creepy and simple, and comes relatively soon after Robbie notices that his silverware's bent. So, you know, the kitchen is kind of the first instance of all of these relatively benign but foreboding signs happen. So that's my favorite.
Which is interesting because a lot of times the kitchen is the gathering place for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens right after Carol Ann is again staring at a TV just covered with static, like again she was communicating with it. I also like how much fun they're having with stuff at the beginning of it, that it's something cool and weird and they don't really appreciate how dangerous it's going to be later.
I don't have a favorite scene, but I have a scene that has stuck with me. The scene where the boy is getting eaten by the tree. I know so many people who have had fear of trees in storms because of that, and I was one of those people. I had a tree just about the same size, really craggy and scary looking, and every time we'd have a storm, I was so afraid that tree would come to life and start eating people.
I guess Spielberg based it on a creepy tree that he had outside his window when he was growing up, so...
He definitely tapped into something there, a more general fear for people.
For me, we were speaking earlier about the effects. It's one of the effects I think really still holds up. It's the house imploding. I absolutely adore that shot. Not only because it's a great visual, but also how it was done. They actually just built this perfect model of the house, built it over this giant vacuum tube, put little wires onto all the points on the inside, and it was actually filled with all this perfect miniature furniture. Turned on the vacuum, pulled the wires, and then had a couple of the effects guys blasting it with shotguns, and it was over in like a split second, just poof, gone. Filmed in slow motion. They sent it to Steven Spielberg while he was reviewing footage from E.T., and he watched it in the screening room, and supposedly the projectionist, after it ran, suddenly yelled, "Holy shit, what was that?" And it looks amazing in the movie. And Spielberg actually, I guess, still has what's left of the house in this little glass case sitting on his piano in his office.
I hadn't realized it was real. I kind of want to see it again now.
The wonderful thing about that scene is that that's the end. Their typical American dream is over. The house has been destroyed. Everybody in the area knows their secrets. They are leaving.
Yeah, it's like this final statement. It's like ghostly foreclosure. Boom, we're taking this with us. All right, what's everybody's recommendations? If they like this movie, what other movies do you think they'd like?
I have a couple of recommendations, and they're vastly different from each other. If you want to delve deeper into suburbia and what's on the surface rather than what's actually inside, I would see American Beauty or preferably The Ice Storm. If you want to go for a movie that's much more on the paranormal side of things and ghosts who are in unrest, 13 Ghosts. It sounds a little cheesy, some of the actors are cheesy, but it is fairly terrifying.
Now, would that be the original or the remake?
Oh, the remake.
Okay.
This really was a foundation for a lot of what modern horror does, and it's hard to compare it to other things. The relatively recent horror film, It Follows, had a little bit of similarities to me because it also focuses on one essentially family unit, a friend unit in that case, in a relatively residential, a little more run down, but residential area, and something persistently following them. And going about it in a relatively immature or inexperienced way, not having a lot of great resources or understanding, and also the creepiness of there not being big explosions or anything jumping out at you, very little music. It reminded me a lot of that.
And there's that kind of division between childhood and adulthood that runs through both movies. I went for a couple that are a little bit more traditional. One is The Orphanage, the Spanish language one, which again involves a lost child in a house and parapsychologists showing up to try and figure out what happened. Really beautiful, creepy, and moving movie that again is very minimal in how it uses special effects and things. It's a lot more just visual sleight of hand. And a British TV movie, Ghostwatch, which was this great kind of Orson Welles sort of gag on Halloween where they filmed what looked like paranormal investigators exploring this poltergeist in this house, and things get creepier and creepier. It was filmed so realistically, people actually thought it was really happening and started panicking all over England, to the point where they never aired it again. You can find it all over the internet, though. It's very creepy stuff.
Now, I mean, one final thought is, we're not, and maybe they did this to allow for the sequels, but, there's not complete closure. Even if the house did implode, we don't know where that spirit went. Obviously, it can elude people thinking that it is gone, and that's nice when it's a little bit open-ended. I mean, in the movie, after they think they get rid of it in the moving scene, if the credits aren't rolling yet, something else is going to be happening.
Also, story-wise, you've got to watch out for that false victory.
It does lead to one of the only real flaws I have with the movie is, why would they stay in that house for those last few hours before they moved?
Right. They were still packing up.
Yeah.
I don't think they physically could have been gone yet.
After an instant, I would not sleep in that house.
I wouldn't have let kids play in a room where there's been a portal to the afterworld.
I'm not taking a bath.
No.
I don't want to be naked in that house.
I would have told the movers, go in, get the stuff out, put it in the truck. We'll be out here.
put a bed on the truck just so that we can sleep in the truck off the property.
Well, horror movies wouldn't be horror movies if the characters weren't idiots that open things they shouldn't.
Yeah. One other note also about the whole cemetery and not actually moving the bodies. The creepy thing is that actually is based on a true incident that happened.
It doesn't surprise me.
In fact, it was the inspiration for another haunted house movie, The Changeling, where to save money they removed some of the graves but not the poor kind of paupers' graves. They just left that there and built a house over it. And of course, surprise, creepy stuff supposedly happened in that house.
Similar things have happened around here. I know the old Danvers Mental Hospital, they had graves and graves and graves. They moved a bunch of them, but they moved them a little off site, very little off site, and they dumped them all in one great mass, so you have no idea who's who.
Well, a lot of them were just numbers, too, which is creepy.
Right.
Even, with the numbers, they were just all in one big pile. It was like a mass grave.
I bet that happens a lot more than people think, because that's acres and acres of land that essentially is being unused, depending on how you feel about it. So as space becomes a commodity in certain parts of the world, it's going to happen.
I just have an image of somebody building a golf course over one, and the golf course being haunted, hands coming up out of the ground and grabbing the ball and moving it and messing up their game.
That would be great.
Okay, that ends our conversation, but not the discussion. If you'd like to have your say about Poltergeist or feel that we missed something, check out the comment section for this episode on cinemaspection.blogspot.com and start talking. Email your comments, complaints, questions, and suggestions to cinemaspection@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page, and our show is available on Stitcher and iTunes. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to us, and if you have a moment to spare, please leave us a review. We appreciate any feedback you can offer. We'll be back to discuss another movie next time. Until then, remember to keep watching closely. There is more to a movie than just what's on the screen.